Use the following video to answer these questions. What was the major issue that arose following the death of Muhammad? What is a caliph? Who were the Rashidun? What are Shiites, also Shis, Kharijites, and the Umayyads? What are some arguments provided as evidence for Ali's claim to the caliphate? Who were Hassan and Hussein? What happened at Karbala? What is an imam? What are their roles? Who are the Ahl Bayt? By the time of Muhammad's death, he had brought most of the western half of Arabia into one single ummah, a community that cut across tribes and religious groups. Muhammad wasn't their king, though. The tribes still functioned as they had always done, roughly independent of each other and each governed loosely by its own elders and other affluent members. Muhammad, instead, remained as an intertribal arbitrator. If there was an issue that arose between groups, say a feud, or an issue that involved them all, like a war, then Muhammad would step in to speak and act on behalf of the whole ummah. Part of this authority was also grounded in Muhammad's claim to be a prophet, someone in contact with God. Like most authority figures in his own day, Muhammad was considered by many of his people to have been ordained by God to create this ummah and hold it together. And that would have been a relatively normal-sounding claim. The Romans, Persians, and Ethiopians all would have claimed that their respective rulers and governors were ordained by God. Where Muhammad was different, though, was that he was at the helm of something novel, something that never existed before. This ummah, that held many tribes and religious sects together in a loose confederation, was unlike anything from the past. There was no clear precedent for how it was to work. There were no official positions, fixed laws, or standing armies. But then, there's our problem. How does this community keep operating without the man who created it? Something like this had never existed before, and so no one was really clear on what to do next. When Muhammad died, the elders of the tribes gathered into a shura, an intertribal council, to discuss what to do next. Meeting on the portico of the tribe of Saida in the year 632, right as Muhammad's funeral was in the works, the tribal representatives debated on how to proceed. At the end of the shura, Muhammad's friend Abu Bakr rose to take Muhammad's place, and most of the influential people in the Ummah swore allegiance to him. Abu Bakr had become the first Khalifa, a caliph. Literally meaning a steward or a placeholder, a caliph is someone who rules in the absence of someone else. In this case, the Ummah's proper governor should be God or his prophet Muhammad. But as Muhammad is dead, and communication with God is thus cut off, someone else must rise to the task and serve as a steward. In this case, Abu Bakr. And from here on, anyone who claims the authority to govern over the Ummah would carry this title of Caliph. In the ages to come, there will be caliphs who are just mere figureheads, others who are mighty emperors, and others again who are more or less just local kings. But as of right now, in the early 7th century, This first caliph, Abu Bakr, was just a tribal leader who was attempting to hold together the community that his friend had started 23 years earlier. Abu Bakr and the three caliphs that followed him would later be known as the Rashidun, the rightly guided ones, the four rightly guided caliphs. These four caliphs would define the transformation of Muhammad's ummah into something much more complicated and widespread than a small band of Arabian tribes. By the end of the 3 decades of time in which the four Rashidun caliphs reigned, the ummah would be a far-flung international state with official systems of management and government. In the imagination of many Muslims in future ages, including today, the Rashidun Caliphate was something of a golden age of Islam, when the friends and companions of Muhammad still walked the earth, and this new ummah was ascendant. But, as these things go, the Rashidun period was in truth very sticky and rather confusing. Abu Bakr's time at the Caliphate would be short. He would die just 2 years after Muhammad. And most of that time, he would spend fighting various battles later called the Ridda Wars, the wars with those who tried to break away from the Ummah. Remember again that in a tribal environment, there's nothing like fixed laws. Instead, people deal with other people. You don't make an alliance with a government. There is no government. But you make an alliance with a certain head of a certain tribe. So, where does that alliance stand when the tribal chieftain that you allied with dies? Well, it's not clear. So when Muhammad died, many of the alliances that he had forged between tribes were now up in the air. And sure enough, several tribes did try to break away. Abu Bakr fought to keep the Ummah in place. For the most famous instance of this, the tribe of Hanifa claimed that their leader, Musaylama, was a prophet, just like Muhammad was, and therefore they were free to break from the Ummah and forge a nation of their own. Abu Bakr crushed this would-be rebellion, and Musaylama was killed, keeping the Hanifa in the Ummah. Abu Bakr seems to have understood the precarious nature of this new Ummah, and especially its problem of who was to rule in Muhammad's stead. We know this because he seems to have arranged how rule was to pass from person to person. Abu Bakr arranged to have the caliphate pass to Umar ibn al-Khattab. Although Umar had joined Muhammad's movement when he was still in Mecca, he was also a vocal opponent of Muhammad for years before that. But in time, Umar became a trusted member of Muhammad's inner circle of friends. When he rose to the caliphate, Umar began the expansion of the Ummah outside of Arabia in earnest. The Levant, Egypt, and nearly all of Persia soon became part of this new intertribal Ummah. In fact, the Ummah was now more than just a tribal confederation. At this point, it was approaching something like an empire. This expansion would cost Umar dearly. Umar's time as caliph was cut short when a Persian assassinated him. And so the problem of who was to be caliph arose yet again. There was a second shura held, and they selected Uthman ibn Affan. Now, this was a controversial choice that would set the stage for generations to come. Uthman was a member of the House of Umayyah, one of the wealthiest families in Mecca. Most of the Umayyah family did not join up with Muhammad's movement while he was alive. Uthman was a rare exception. The Umayyah family only ended up joining the Ummah after the Ummah had claimed Mecca in the year 630. So, in other words, most of the House of Umayyah was only part of the Ummah because they lost in their conflict with Muhammad, and not because they actually wanted to be a part of his movement. And everyone knew this. Most people held the Umayyah family in some disdain. They were only on our side because it was politically expedient to be. And then, suddenly, one of the sons of Umayyah was the caliph. And what does this Uthman do? He starts appointing all of his own family members to positions of power in the caliphate. Many of the oldest members of the Ummah saw this as pure nepotism. Uthman was just in it for himself and his family. And again, the caliph would be assassinated. Uthman was killed in 656 when a series of rebels from Egypt and Iraq sieged his house in a successful attempt to overthrow him. This new Ummah, now much bigger, more diverse, and more powerful than it had been in Muhammad's time 23 years earlier, was in disarray. There was a gathering in the Prophet's house in Medina, and again, the question of who was to be caliph was asked. This time, the caliphate was handed to Ali, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, one of the first people to accept his message. Ali had a popular following on the ground, but his election to the caliphate was controversial to say the least. Up in Syria, Muawiyah, the governor, one of these members of the House of Umayyah that Uthman had appointed, defected from the Ummah in protest. Two of Muhammad's old companions, Zubair and Talha, backed by one of Muhammad's own widows, rebelled, both attempting to make themselves caliph. The reign of Ali and his conflict with the fellow companions of Muhammad and with the House of Umayyah would later be referred to as the fitna, the strife, or the striving, the messy civil war between the factions and families of the Ummah. Ali would eventually defeat the rebels Talha and Zubair, both of whom died in battle. But Muawiyah was a different case. The supporters of Ali and the House of Umayyah went to battle at a place called Siffin in what is today Syria in the year 657. The carnage was extreme. While the tribal battles of Muhammad's days, a generation earlier, probably only involved a few hundred people, Ali and Muawiyah commanded massive armies of tens of thousands of professionally trained soldiers. Eventually, the two sides agreed to a ceasefire and an arbitration, but even this would lead to trouble. Remember that Muawiyah was a member of the House of Umayyah and a family appointee of Uthman. Uthman may have been an early convert to Muhammad's movement, but Muawiyah and the rest of the House of Umayyah were certainly not. And so many of Ali's supporters thought that even negotiating with this other side was tantamount to treachery. Ali's followers were divided. Those who stayed loyal to Ali would later be referred to as the Shiites, or Shis, the Shi'at Ali, the party or partisans of Ali. In other words, a Shiite was someone who thought that political control of the Ummah belonged to Ali. Ali was fairly elected, he was a family member and a confidant of the Prophet himself, and if Ali thought it was wise to negotiate with the enemy, so be it. I mean, sometimes politics is the art of compromise, right? But many people broke away from Ali for even trying to work with this supposedly wicked Muawiyah and the Umayyah family. To compromise with evil people means that you must be evil yourself, right? Someone of virtue and nobility never backs down from their principles. People who thought this way would later be referred to as the defectors, the Kharijites, the ones who went out from their alliance with Ali as the caliph. These Kharijites argued that if Ali deals with traitors, he must be a traitor himself, and therefore he is not worthy to be the caliph. And one of these defectors, these Kharijites, would indeed assassinate Ali in 661, putting an end to the Rashidun period. Upon Ali's death, Muawiyah installed himself as caliph and tried to begin a proper dynasty, That is, a hereditary claim to rule that would pass along family lines, like kings and emperors did in other countries. These would be the Umayyun, the Umayyads, the rule of the House of Umayyah, which lasted from 661, the death of Ali, all the way to the year 750. The rise of the Umayyads marked the end of the Rashidun, and the breaking point of the Ummah's transformation into a true empire. Muawiyah moved the capital of this empire from Medina, Muhammad's own sanctuary city, to the much more ancient and populous city of Damascus up in Syria. Now, there were an official ruling family of caliphs, a royal house in all but name. And there, in a centrally located capital city that had nothing to do with Muhammad and the tribes of the Hijaz, the Umayyads began great public works across their fledgling empire. They instituted Arabic as the official language of government, therefore making this once minor family of dialects an international language of commerce and administration. They minted coins, like the Persians and Romans did. And they created steady systems of political office and taxation. If the early Rashidun Caliphate was driven by the zeal and passion of Muhammad's original movement, the Umayyads were driven by stability and nation building. By the height of the Umayyad period, the word Muslim, submitter, was the de facto way that a citizen of this new empire would have identified themselves. The Ummah was Islam, and to be a true member of this Ummah was to be a Muslim. But don't think that everyone in this new empire thought that Muslim or Islam meant the same things. Serious differences of opinion about what this Ummah was supposed to be and what this caliphate was supposed to be reigned. The Quran, and for that matter Muhammad, never really dealt with such an eventuality. When the Quran spoke, it was addressing Arabic speakers living in the tribal setting of the Hijaz, and specifically to the people of the Quraysh tribe. Likewise, as far as we know, Muhammad never imagined that his relatively small intertribal confederation would end up a great world empire to rival the Romans or the Persians. So, when members of this community, these Muslims, asked themselves who was to rule, how, and why, in other words, when they asked themselves what authority is, it wasn't clear in the slightest. There are three possible answers to this problem. First, there's the Umayyad answer. If the Ummah is like an empire, treat it like an empire, have a ruling family, and so a stable system of government and succession. Have official languages, court systems, coinage, and all that. It was silly to treat the Ummah as a loose confederation of tribes. Those days were long gone. The Umayyad path would lead to stability, but it was also, in effect, asking the Ummah to transform from an idealized community based on submission to God and service to one's neighbors into just one more empire. Then there was the Kharijite answer. You do what is morally correct, regardless of the outcome. We shouldn't be governed by a family of nobles like other nations. We're not other nations. We should be ruled by those who are worthy of rule. The most virtuous should be the caliph, the one who stands in place of Muhammad on earth. And if the caliph is evil or consorts with evil people, well, then he's no caliph at all. He has to be overthrown or even killed. The Kharijite answer was idealistic. Only the most godly, moral, and upstanding should rule. But it's also not very realistic. I mean, who is to say who is this perfect caliph? Aren't a lot of different people going to think that they deserve to be the caliph? Isn't this bound to cause fighting? And then finally, there's the Shiite answer, which is somewhere in the middle of the two. In the old days, tribes were ruled along family lines. After all, tribes are just extended families themselves. But they're not ruled as dynasties, where rule passes from father to son. Instead, the rule of the tribe stayed in the family, but passed to those who were worthy of rule, even if it wasn't a straight line of parent to child. Maybe leadership of a tribe would pass from father to son, but it could also pass to a son-in-law, or a cousin, or a brother, or an uncle. So, this is slightly like the Umayyad answer, because there is a fixed ruling family. Not just anyone could claim to be in charge of this ummah. But it's also slightly like the Kharijite answer, where personal worth and leadership skills are factored into it. Last time, we looked at the traditional biography of Muhammad, and we mentioned that Islamic history would someday be defined by how one interprets the events of Muhammad's life. Perhaps Muhammad did have a line of succession in mind who would rule after him. Or perhaps the results of the councils of elders who met when the Prophet died was simply the wrong result. And these questions about whether the political history of Islam unfolded as Muhammad, or for that matter as God, intended, would someday blossom in the future, is what we call Shi'ism. The big question is, did Muhammad have any plans or preferences for Ali, or someone else, to govern his ummah when he passed away? Now, for the Shiites in the 7th century, as today, Ali was supposed to be the first caliph, not the fourth, and Muhammad himself intended as much. If the Ummah's history disintegrated into political intrigue and assassinations and civil wars, it's because the Ummah had deviated from the Prophet's commands upon his death. Look at it this way. Muhammad had no adult male children, so no obvious heirs. But Ali was the closest thing Muhammad did have to one. Ali was the first person to embrace Muhammad's message after his wife Khadija, and she died before Muhammad did. Indeed, Ali believed in Muhammad's prophecy when he was just a child. And Ali was an actual relative of Muhammad. He was his first cousin. Ali's father, Abu Talib, raised Muhammad for a time, and so they were very close in upbringing too. There are several reports of Muhammad calling Ali his brother. And Ali later married Muhammad's daughter Fatima, making Ali the second oldest man in Muhammad's house, after Muhammad himself, more or less his heir as the patriarch of the family. And while the tribal leaders were off bickering amongst themselves over who would be caliph, Ali was a stone's throw away with his family, lovingly preparing the Prophet's body for burial. There are some events that also seem to indicate that Muhammad had something special in store for Ali, and thought of him in a unique way. When Muhammad arrived in Medina after the Hijrah, most of his followers from Mecca left behind their families and possessions. And so, to survive, Muhammad started to team people up, one refugee from Mecca to one helper from Medina. Finally was Ali, also an immigrant from Mecca, but Muhammad didn't assign him to anyone. When Ali, quite upset, asked why Muhammad didn't grant him a helper, Muhammad said that it would be he, Muhammad himself, that would be Ali's brother in this world and the world to come. They would support each other. Even more direct to the point was the famous speech that Muhammad gave at Ghadir Qum. There, near the end of Muhammad's life, he stopped between two trees to make his midday prayer with thousands of his followers. Afterwards, Muhammad took Ali by the hand and said, "If I am the master of anyone, then Ali is also their master. Be a supporter of whoever supports Ali, and an enemy to whoever opposes him." This, the Shiites would later claim, was Muhammad directly and publicly proclaiming Ali as his rightful successor, the true caliph. But as we learned last time, there are perfectly legitimate reasons to doubt the historical accuracy of almost any detail of Muhammad's life. Maybe this speech at Qadr Hum was a forgery. Or later people are misunderstanding what it meant. After all, Muhammad doesn't specifically say in this speech that Ali is his successor, just that Ali is a righteous person and should be respected as such. And similarly, interpretation plays into many of the Shiites' other claims about Ali too. Lots of people were close to Muhammad, not just Ali, including all three of the other Rashidun caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman. And likewise, all three of them were also Muhammad's relatives somehow, and all of them were connected to Muhammad by marriage too. So the fact that Ali married Muhammad's daughter may not necessarily mean anything either. This problem gets even more complicated after Ali died. Suppose you're one of these early Shiites, and you think Ali has the rightful and best claim to be caliph. Well, what do you think when Ali dies? After Ali's assassination in 661, that is, the start of Muawiyah's Umayyad dynasty, the Shiites then turned to Ali's sons, Hassan and Hussein. They were the sons of Fatima, Muhammad's beloved daughter, so they were not only Ali's children, they were Muhammad's own biological grandchildren. And many of Ali's Shiites naturally concluded that they were the true descendants of the Prophet by blood, and therefore the natural rulers for the Ummah. But it wasn't to be. First, Hassan, the eldest grandson of Muhammad, publicly declared that he wasn't interested in being caliph. Muawiyah could just have it. Now, historically, we're not sure what to do with his claim. Perhaps Hassan just wasn't a politically minded person. Or maybe he just struck some sort of deal with Muawiyah where he would remove himself as a claimant to the caliphate. Or maybe Muawiyah and his Umayyad clan threatened Hassan directly, and Hassan spared himself and his family from assassination by simply stepping aside. Who knows? But after Hassan's death, and again, it's not clear if he died of natural causes or was poisoned by the Umayyads, things changed. Hussein, now the oldest living grandson of the Prophet, was very interested in the caliphate, and when Muawiyah died in 680, the issue of who was to be the caliph arose yet again, and so Hussein took his chance. But remember that the Umayyads are trying to create a dynasty, a hereditary monarchy. So when Yazid, Muawiyah's son, claimed the caliphate for himself, the Shiites and several other groups rebelled. In the town of Kufa, modern Iraq, where support for Ali and his family had been the strongest, the local Shiites invited Hussein to join them in an attempt to seize the caliphate back from the Umayyads. And so, with just a few dozen soldiers and family members, Hussein set out for Kufa. But Yazid was not interested in giving up the caliphate to anyone, not even the direct descendant of the Prophet. Yazid dispatched a general and a whole garrison to intercept Hussein before he arrived in Kufa. And then, on the plains of Karbala, the forces of the Umayyad Caliph Yazid wiped out the tiny band of Hussein and his family. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. A few dozen men, women, and children set upon by an entire wing of Yazid's army. Hussein was riddled with arrows and beheaded, and most of his supporters and family were killed. Only one male member of Hussein's immediate family survived. Even for people who didn't really support Hussein and the Shiites' political claims, the events at Karbala were a shock. The grandson of Muhammad himself was murdered, his family annihilated. But for those who believed in Hussein and the family of Ali, the scandal was even worse. Yes, their political claims were crushed and their would-be leader was killed, but even more so, they now lived under the terror of Yazid, an evil tyrant and the enemy of the Prophet's own family. What were they to do? Their leader was slain. An open revolt didn't work. So instead, the Shiites, in a way, turned their backs on the political order itself, claiming a kind of authority that was more true or more real than any so-called government. they would, in a certain way, create a dynasty of their own, but not of caliphs, but imams. An imam, literally a leader, refers to the spiritual masters of the early Shiites. Not who is materially the ruler of a government, but rather the one who ought to be by divine right. While Ali himself was the first of these imams, and he was a caliph, no imam after him would ever hold any political title. The Shiite movement would gradually transform from a political party, that is, people who supported certain rulers and certain policies, into a religious sect within Islam. Those Muslims that we call Shiites now were those who thought there was something special about these imams, that they were the teachers and guides of all Muslims, regardless of whoever is calling himself the caliph today. And the imam is more than just a caliph. They were people who God had willed power and knowledge to. They weren't prophets, but they did serve the spiritual role that Muhammad once had, understanding God's will and helping people live properly. And in the centuries to come, Shiites would attribute miraculous power to their imams, seeing them as the spokespeople of God on earth. Throughout history, different Shiites have made different claims about different people as their imams. And variations of Shiism like this continue today. What all Shiites, though, then and now, do agree on is that the imams are all members of the Ahl Bayt, the people of the house. That is, the house of Muhammad through Ali and Muhammad's daughter Fatima and their immediate descendants. God has set apart the house of Muhammad, and specifically this line within his house, to be the true leaders, the true imams of the Muslim Ummah. While in theory, these imams should be the caliphs, their authority is something more than mere earthly politics. These imams from the Ahl Bayt were the authority in Islam in all of its forms, spiritual as well as legal. Who exactly each of these imams are is debated. All Shiites today agree that Ali, Hassan, and Hussein are imams. After that, it depends which Shiite you ask and where. The vast majority of Shiites today are Ithna Ashariya, 12ers, meaning that they think that there are 12 imams, starting with Ali and continuing on until the end of their line in the 9th century. There are populations of these 12ers in many places, but they're most especially well represented in the so-called Shiite Crescent, which includes Persia, modern Iran, eastern Iraq, and large parts of Lebanon and Syria. Other, much smaller Shiite communities disagree on who is an imam and how many imams there are. For instance, the Zaydi Shiites, today found mostly in Yemen, argue that there are only 5 of these imams. The Nizari Ismailis, found primarily in the subcontinent of India and Pakistan, and also Afghanistan, believe that the line of imams never ended. There's still an imam today, in the form of the 4th Aga Khan, Prince Shah Karim al-Husseini. For these Ismailis, he is the 49th imam, a direct descendant of Muhammad. Shiites of all these kinds, and a few others, account for about 10 to 15% of Muslims on earth today. Shiites have always been in the minority, but neither should we view them as hermetically sealed away from other forms of Islam, whether in the late antique period, the Middle Ages, or today. Plenty of non-Shiite Muslims also have a special reverence for Muhammad's family, the Ahl Bayt, and may even address them as imams. And many important historical figures throughout Islamic history are not clearly Shiite nor non-Shiite. They just sort of dabble between both. What was the major issue that arose following the death of Muhammad? What is a caliph? Who were the Rashidun? What are Shiites, also Shis, Kharijites, and the Umayyads? What are some arguments provided as evidence for Ali's claim to the caliphate? Who were Hassan and Hussein? What happened at Karbala? What is an imam? What are their roles? And who are the Ahl Bayt?